Collecting vintage computers on eBay is not easy. Poor condition, lack of information, bad pictures, and sellers putting $200 on anything makes it tough enough. Add shipping costs into this mix and you think that would be enough to deter me from continuing this hobby. Most of the time though, once something interesting pulls me in and I can safely afford it, I'll take the plunge and hope for the best. Sometimes, UPS wants to throw that last wild card into the mix, and by throw, I mean actually throw. In the case of this custom Dell Optiplex 466 MXE, it was treated more as a volleyball than a vintage computer on its short journey to me. If you're also a collector, then maybe you're kind of feeling how I felt when I opened the box. I did not buy a garbage dump find either, as the ad clearly showed a good condition desktop, making this destruction all the more difficult to see. The front bezel is completely snapped off and split in a few pieces, with the reset button and several clips suffering the same fate. The 5¼ inch drives tried to escape from the rail cage diagonally when it was bent. The intake fan mount assembly is twisted, 2 thumb screws for the cover are bent, and the force of the impact slid off one side of the cover while it was still screwed in. Lastly, the processor's lever retention catch snapped off from the socket as well. It now mostly stays engaged by sheer determination. Somehow, after all that, it still powers on. This poor thing didn't come with a hard drive, and I'm positive if it did, it would not have survived. As you can hear, the fan is not doing so well, but that's a typical Optiplex thing. So as you can see, this is a custom Optiplex 466 MXE. At some point in its life, the motherboard was switched out for that of an Optiplex XM 5100. This brought it from the 66 MHz 486 DX2 it originally shipped with, to the 100 MHz Pentium it has now. Now that this desecrated desktop has shown it wants to live, it is time to fix it. Every bezel post cleanly snapped off and stayed secured to the steel cover, so I think they will reattach without too much trouble. The bezel itself is in 3 main pieces with smaller parts like the reset button and some clips snapped off. Thankfully, all these pieces were still rattling around inside the case. I think this is a job for epoxy. First plan is to get the snapped posts off of the cover. Dell went out of their way to make this a little more bothersome than usual by using Torx screws. That's always fantastic. Before removing them, I marked each one with a number, since they all broke off in their own way. This, of course, takes out the guesswork once they're removed. With everything ready to go, it's time to start reattaching. Dry fitting and marking orientation is a good way to make this process go by easier, as the timer is set once the epoxy is mixed and applied. Now, this part of the process was difficult to record while handling everything, but as you can see, it isn't terribly interesting and repetitive anyway. I had to hold pieces in place the best I could as the epoxy cured, and had to go back to mix more several times in various stages of this repair. It certainly was not easy getting the main bezel pieces back on in a way that looked good from the outside. Another set of hands would have definitely helped big time. What I ended up with is nowhere near perfect, but I'm happy with it. Being back in one piece and not going to the garbage are much better outcomes. With the epoxy curing, I can move on to addressing the rest of the issues with this desktop. A good place to start were the 5¼ inch drives. The bend on the drive cage was making the top support twist the plastic holding the fan. Luckily, the plastics didn't warp or crack. The metal cage was thoroughly bent, prompting a complete teardown to the front of the chassis. To my surprise, all of these components can be easily unscrewed and slid off of the plastic base piece. The power supply got a little deformed too from an impact, bending out the metal housing at this screw. With some persuasion, it bent right back into place and allowed the screws for it in the base to be installed. After this, why not replace the CMOS battery while it's accessible? Attempting to fix the cooling fan wouldn't hurt either, so off it goes. After bending the drive cage back into shape by hand, it goes right back in where it's supposed to. The top support bracket now no longer pulls the plastics over as well. Test fitting the 5 1/4 inch drives was a success, so with that, it was time to plug everything back in and briefly test for power on and set the BIOS. Some further testing revealed a problem with the secondary IDE channel. At first I thought it was the CD-ROM drive, the IDE cable, or the BIOS not being set properly, but fixing or replacing these didn't seem to do anything. I went ahead and set the jumpers to run both a hard drive and a CD-ROM drive off of the primary channel, but it would always result in this error. Plugging in a hard drive alone worked well, and an old install of Windows 95 even booted from this drive. I come back to this later. Now to attempt quieting that noisy fan by oiling the bearing. As you can see, the paper label did not cooperate very well, and my heat gun was off hiding somewhere. After the oil took and silenced the fan better than I anticipated, I just got rid of the label entirely. I did replace the label with a limited edition transparent one. After what turned into a couple of days of curing, the bezel was ready to be reinstalled. Like I said before, this repair is nowhere near perfect, with that one corner still in very rough shape. I'm definitely not a master of this craft, but again, it is better than a pile of pieces. The alignment of the posts were not dead on with the steel cover, so I ended up making the holes larger with a unibit and switching to different screws with washers. After many test fits of the bezel, trying to reinstall the whole thing onto the computer produced what I think are acceptable results. You can plainly see some margins are off and the front and center crack at the top is quite visible, but I can live with this. Finally, with these damages out of the way, it was time to move on to getting a hard drive prepared and install an operating system. It has been a while since I last had to use F-disk in format, so admittedly I did have to do this part a couple of times to get to where this hard drive is at now. The capacity is actually 20 gigabytes, but something was preventing use of half of this. It could be the BIOS, F-disk itself, the boot disk's limitations, I'm not entirely sure. Let me know in the comments what you might think. In any case, the roughly 8 GB that did show up is more than enough for this system. For the OS, I went with Windows 95 OSR 2.5. I wanted to try installing it from the hard drive, but opted for doing it from a CD. This made for a good test of the optical drive, considering it too was violently shaken up from the shipping company. Turns out it was not fazed by the journey at all and worked without issue. With the OS complete, it was time to physically install the hard drive since I had it loosely connected during this process, just in case I had to switch to something else. So, now that it has been demonstrated the system is running both a hard drive and a CD-ROM drive after the earlier troubles with the IDE channels, I should probably explain. Parallel ATA has its own quirks when it comes to setting up drives, but these and many other vintage Optiplexes come with even more. They can be very picky, and after experimenting, I found both channels were in working order, and that they just want unintuitive jumper settings. For this system, removing the jumper entirely from the hard drive made the primary channel function correctly, and setting the CD-ROM drive's jumper to primary made this function on the secondary channel. A little confusing, but the results are good. While I was at it, I also found a network card in my stash of parts that has readily available Windows 95 drivers, so in it goes. I know having such old hardware on the internet is not all that great of an idea, but I do prefer being able to do network transfers of games and software. The drivers for this card are actually from Dell, so that's a nice coincidence. The installation even went well with very little fuss. Testing it out briefly, it is amazing Google even loaded at all in any capacity. At this point, the hardware was good to go, so the case went back on and it was time to load what I wanted on here. That sound takes you right back every time. Starting off with the original Roller Coaster Tycoon, it is very noticeable how slow this runs. Considering a Pentium 2 or a K6 with 32 megabytes of RAM is recommended for this game, this is really not a surprise. Having it still run on about half of the recommended hardware specs is pretty impressive, though more busy parts bring down things to unplayable levels. What is more than playable is the original Command & Conquer. This is the Windows 95 version, so if this runs this well, I am sure the DOS version would too. Looking at the Need for Speed Special Edition, again the limits of this system get pushed. Settings are almost all at low, and it's definitely playable, but input lag is very present. Test Drive Off-Road also presents a challenge, being mostly playable at super low settings. Upping the settings, especially to SVGA, brings things to a crawl. Rampage World Tour brought on some interesting problems. It does start up and run and even gets to gameplay, but I could not see where to set controls for anything other than moving. The game also has some strange graphical issues when going from full screen back to window, requiring a reboot. For this last section, I'll just quickly go through some benchmarking. Big thank you to Phil at Phil's Computer Lab for this package and everything else he has contributed to this hobby. For the most part, the lower end benchmarks perform well on this hardware, with scaled up versions being where this Pentium struggles. Considering this, and most computers like it weren't really meant for 3D gaming, I think the results produced are more than good enough. Doom's performance is not a surprise, and I'm happy with how Quake performs. From presumably doing office tasks at the beginning, to being upgraded with newer parts, to being phased out and stored somewhere for years, to being destroyed by UPS, and then finally brought back to function here. This old desktop has been through a lot. The history of this computer will continue, and I am pleased to have it as part of the collection. On that note, go save a vintage computer today. And that will be a wrap for this video. Thanks for watching.